Does everyone need to remove gluten? This is something that a lot of people ask when approaching a healthier lifestyle or considering potential things to include or exclude in their daily diet.
What's up and welcome to Sam Miller Science, where you're joining me just over a decade into my personal journey of working to bridge the gap between metabolism, macros, muscle, and medicine, all while helping coaches scale the impact that they desire and deserve. If you are here, thank you so much for listening and for trusting me to help you elevate your coaching game or to lead you in your transformation to realize your true potential. In either case, each week I'll be sharing my methods, models, and message to serve as leverage for your specific goals. Without further ado, let's get on to today's show.
Now, if you're not familiar with gluten, the reason why it receives so much spotlight and potential controversy is because it's a component of food that has been said to induce intestinal permeability or contribute to one of the popular social media gut topics, which is leaky gut. Now, leaky gut is really just more the layman's term for intestinal permeability, which is what's studied more so in research and what's actually going on in terms of gut barrier function in the body. Now, inside today's episode, I'm going to talk about what population should potentially exclude or include gluten in their daily diet, or as far as how we can approach this from a nutrition perspective. We'll also talk about why it's a little bit controversial, how it actually works in terms of eliciting its potential negative effects if you are someone who's sensitive, and just some considerations or particular groups of people who may need to steer clear of gluten. Now, first, we have to kind of set the record straight, and this is especially for people who think gluten is only a problem for people with celiacs, because I really see two camps. It's either the type of folks who pretty much just track their calories, and they'll say things along the lines of like, well, gluten is only a problem if you have celiacs. On the other side, we'll see individuals who will say that actually gluten's bad for everyone needs to remove it. And this is misleading and also kind of sparks additional controversy around food, which we can never really seem to escape in the nutrition space. So first, to set the record straight, there are certain subsets of the population who may need to exclude gluten even if they don't have celiacs. I'll elaborate why. There's really going to be kind of two main reasons for this. And even if you don't have celiacs, that doesn't necessarily mean you should just go hard in the paint on pizza, pasta, and bread just because you don't have celiac disease, right? There's still other reasons that we might want to include other foods or moderate our intake of those foods, especially things like pizza, pasta, bread's very easy for folks to overconsume, especially in a Western diet where they're already consuming ample calories. So first and foremost, we have enough data to now indicate that non-celiac gluten sensitivity is definitely real. So based on research related to gastroenterology journals, many other components of actual scholarly based evidence, we can see that folks may have a sensitivity to this particular food, even if they don't have celiacs. Now, in terms of celiacs, around 0.5% of the population has celiacs, and that's been like officially diagnosed, right? Not self-diagnosed celiacs, but if you're actually looking at the numbers in research based off of folks who maybe go to their gastroenterologist and they receive a celiac diagnosis, or they go to a medical professional and receive that diagnosis. When it comes to non-celiac gluten sensitivity, a review study from 2019 shows that basically 13% of people may experience it, and an updated review from 2021 puts that figure up to 14.9%, so almost 15%, which would be about 1 in 6 people, which is pretty decent percentage of the population. Contrasting that with the amount of people who are gluten-free, we actually see the numbers around people who elect to follow a gluten-free diet, or maybe prioritize a gluten-free diet, or maybe aspire to gluten-free eating. We see that in a survey put forth by NPR, roughly 1/3 of Americans prefer to be gluten-free or strive to be gluten-free, or basically try to follow a gluten-free diet as best they can. And that number goes up if we look at specific populations. For example, in athletic and fit populations, up to 50% of people try to follow a gluten-free diet. So if you're someone who watches a lot of health and fitness YouTube videos, if you're on Instagram in the social media space, if you are frequently working out, or you're someone who's maybe a coach or trainer yourself, chances are you've probably heard a lot about potentially going gluten-free, maybe even gluten and dairy-free. And some of its popularity did originate in its effectiveness for helping people manage autoimmune systems and a few other conditions that I'll talk about later inside today's episode. So there's probably a lot more people who are being restrictive with their diet compared to a true need, intolerance, or actual full-blown issue like celiacs, to where they have to be removing gluten. Now, there is a reason why they might feel better when they're removing gluten, and I can speak to a couple of those as we're moving through the content today. One could be the potential FODMAPs in wheat-containing products. Could also be the facilities where these grain products are processed. Another thing is a lot of grain products are sprayed with a fair amount of pesticides and things which, if people are sensitive to, could be impacting their symptoms. So it may not just be the gluten or the grains, it could also be factors related to the processing and bringing to market, essentially taking those foods from farm to table. So let's talk a little bit about the negative results from clinical trials on IBS and realize that even with a background of gut issues, gluten doesn't have to be a problem, or it might not be the only problem. Is probably a better way to say that, right? So while someone still may derive some benefits from maybe substituting other more nutrient-dense foods in place of gluten, there's basically some evidence to support that a gluten-free diet for this particular IBS population wasn't a cure-all, a miracle, panacea of any sort. It was basically, an intervention that wasn't necessarily fully effective. So in one double-blind randomized controlled trial, they enrolled participants and claimed that they all had non-celiac gluten sensitivity. So these participants have basically described themselves as having the sensitivity to gluten. They gave all participants a gluten-free diet for 3 weeks, and after this, one group received a pill with gluten and the other received a placebo. Remember, nobody knows who's getting what here. That's part of the randomized controlled trial process and the fact that this is double blind. So not even the researchers knew who was receiving the gluten versus who was receiving the placebo. After the study was completed, just 14% of the participants were deemed to have true non-celiac gluten sensitivity as measured by symptom relapse and original symptom remission during the gluten-free period. Similarly, you can look at any trial that eliminates gluten for a specific issue, and we never really see that 100% response rate, right? It's never perfect, especially when you look at entire cohorts and not just individuals, right? So instead of an N of 1, if we actually look at an entire sample of people, usually 30 to 80% of people tend to respond positively. So there's always people who don't experience relief from gluten elimination, which signals that it may come from another source. Now, there's a lot of common irritants in the human diet. Gluten does tend to be a scapegoat at times, but there are certainly other foods that could be a trigger for certain people in terms of their symptoms, negative quality of life, poor biofeedback, leading to poor digestion, fatigue, etc. So again, not as many people as we may think are sensitive to gluten. And this begs the question, how do you know if you should be gluten-free or not? What population should pay a little bit more attention to this diet, or who can maybe have a little bit more freedom in terms of incorporating these foods on a regular basis? Besides being celiac, we do have a list of conditions from the data that may benefit from going gluten-free. That's not to say that gluten-free is an entire treatment for your condition. This is not medical advice. This is just based on the research at hand, that this potential nutritional strategy may benefit people in terms of symptom management, quality of life, or other beneficial markers in terms of the research. The one that's probably the most obvious and should be said is IBS, or irritable bowel syndrome. Remember, this is an umbrella condition, so this means that it incorporates a lot of different types of digestive struggles or digestive complications. It's not necessarily just one thing. This could be constipation or diarrhea, and it could come from a number of different things, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, or so much more. Autoimmune disease is also a reason to potentially go gluten-free or opt for gluten-free options, particularly if you have rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, MS, Hashimoto's, psoriasis, and there's potentially even more here, but those are the ones that we seem to have the most research on right now. We just have the most actual data, right? So you could mechanistically kind of look at this in terms of the human body, and you can make arguments in terms of immune system functionality as to why it may be beneficial. But as far as what the data supports at this time, we seem to have rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, MS, Hashimoto's, psoriasis, which is more of a skin condition, but has kind of an autoimmune gut immune flair to it, and potentially others as well. Fibromyalgia, endometriosis, which is typically classified as more as a women's reproductive health condition, but has a lot of inflammatory components and almost pseudo autoimmune-like components as well. Schizophrenia and other mental health conditions. Now, obviously, consult a mental health professional and determine what diet helps you to feel the best and what nutrition is going to be best for you. Again, these are not any type of treatment recommendation or advice for these particular conditions. Just going through where we actually have human samples and people try to go gluten-free, and there's some evidence to support improvements in their overall symptoms and quality of life. Another one is eczema. So eczema and psoriasis being probably two of the more popular skin-related conditions aside from acne, and there does seem to be some reasonable improvement for folks who do go gluten-free. And a number of these different sort of conditions and classifications, you will see that some people will opt for something like paleo, gluten-free, dairy-free, or maybe something that's a Mediterranean-style diet and eliminating grains. So there's a lot of different sort of flavors of elimination and ways that people may find that they personally benefit in terms of alleviating some of their skin conditions or autoimmune conditions. But the most important thing is that you are actually tracking some form of data related to this. So if it's Hashimoto's, make sure you're looking at your TPO antibodies, look at your TJAB, your thyroid values, and track this along with maybe other markers of inflammation like highly sensitive C-reactive protein. Instead of just solely doing it because some influencer on social media told you to, or because it's what worked for them. Another consideration would be people struggling with energy issues, joint pain, general malaise, and issues that may not have a diagnosis attached to it. In some cases, there are gluten elimination studies where we do see improvements in these things, most likely through the lowering of inflammation. If someone has a cluster of symptoms like joint pain, energy issues, kind of unexplainable fatigue, this would be a sign to potentially look at their nutrition a little bit further and consider, some options that may include gluten-free, but also ruling out the possibility of different sort of autoimmune conditions or other potential explanations for what they're struggling with, right? So if someone has energy issues, but they're not sleeping, that is kind of the low-hanging fruit there, right? So we want to make sure that we've addressed other low-hanging fruit, and then we can look at something like gluten to see if it's contributing. If any of the aforementioned considerations apply to you or your clients, then it would be worth removing gluten or testing it, right? You're not going to know unless you try. And what's most important here is, again, not necessarily what someone on social media says or even what I'm saying in this video. It's how you feel and respond to your nutrition and your diet of choice, right? So there's evidence to support a number of different ways that you can eat and that you can exercise. And the most important thing is you find something that you can stick with, adhere to, and really that you're seeing results with, right? It's about your improvements over time, not necessarily just because, Debbie or Pam, the influencer, told you to do something and now you're going to just follow that because they're doing that. So if you do well in removing gluten, or you feel like your symptoms are improving, basically, right? Biofeedback improves. So think of this as sleep, hunger, recovery, energy, digestion, and stress. If those markers are generally improving or quality of life indicators are improving, then you may want to keep it out for a longer period of time and potentially reintroducing some months down the line to see if it's tolerable again. Some people may have to remain gluten-free to continue to alleviate those symptoms. Other folks can add it back in, no problem. So let's imagine a scenario where you, or maybe if let's say you're a coach and you're working with clients, someone eliminates gluten for digestive issues and they get about a 30% improvement. Now let's imagine a scenario where someone potentially removes gluten, or maybe let's say you're a health and fitness coach or nutrition coach or dietitian, and someone removes gluten from their diet and they see maybe 30% improvement, but not all of their symptoms resolve. Many people miss this, and I mentioned it and kind of alluded to it earlier in the episode, is that a lot of wheat products are actually fairly high in FODMAPs. So if you haven't heard of it, there is such a thing as a low FODMAP diet, and in many cases can alleviate symptoms of IBS. Now, when it comes to IBS, particularly diarrhea-dominant IBS, up to 80% of people are sensitive to FODMAP containing foods. And really what's happening here is there's a fermentable nature to the carbohydrates that is compounding some of the digestive troubles. So this could include not only grain-containing products, but there are also fruits and different types of vegetables that can lead to irritation. So we're not just saying, hey, gluten is the problem here. There are going to be other foods, if someone is sensitive to FODMAPs, that could kind of light things up for them, even if they've tried removing gluten, led to improvements. They still may need to remove some other foods in the short term with the idea of getting to a well-balanced diet over time. So in this case of a 30% reduction in symptoms from gluten elimination, think about reducing or removing other FODMAPs or other common irritants in the human diet. So for example, nightshades can be problematic for folks, and see if it was the actual issue, not just gluten, right? Because over time you could potentially reintroduce some of these foods or reintroduce the gluten, especially if the person is not someone who has celiacs. In any case, as we are wrapping up here, gluten is not necessarily a problem for everyone, but it can be a problem for many. And it can be a problem for folks who are sensitive to the FODMAPs that I mentioned. It can be a problem for folks who are sensitive to pesticides. It can be an issue in folks who have non-celiac gluten sensitivity. But that doesn't mean it's necessarily a cure-all for everyone, or that removing gluten is going to bring you the physique or quality of life of your dreams. Remember, we still have to consider other paramount considerations when it comes to our nutrition, like overall energy balance, energy intake, micronutrition, focusing on single ingredient whole foods. Just because you can eat bread or pasta or maybe even certain gluten-containing foods that have a laundry list of ingredients doesn't necessarily mean you should. Just because you can play macro Tetris and fit certain foods in doesn't mean you necessarily should. When it comes to hunger and appetite management, when it comes to micronutrient density, getting in quality protein, there are going to be other foods that we really need to prioritize in order to hit all of our nutritional targets and feel our best. Now, there are going to be some people who are staunch advocates for gluten. There are going to be people who are staunch advocates for eliminating gluten. The purpose of this episode is to understand what evidence currently exists aside from our personal experiences, because I may have had my own experience related to foods that I eat or don't eat in my personal preferences, and you're going to have that as well. So beyond just our individual preferences, we have to be able to understand that there's vast amounts of data and information related to nutrition, and there's a lot of other people who are trying to make these decisions, and they can be influenced, or kind of their decision making can be confounded by all these loud voices and narratives on social media. So the purpose of this episode is not necessarily to speak to a bias of mine, but more so show the pros and cons of the situation, and also talk about people who may benefit from elimination and maybe people who might not have to eliminate it, and why do those people feel okay, whereas other people do not. Now, again, some of the statistics cite that up to 50% of people who are in basically active populations or fit populations, and in the NPR study, we had a large number of people, close to a third, who are trying to follow a gluten-free diet. But that doesn't mean that everyone has to. But if you fall into that camp, if you're in that, 1/3 to 1/2 of people who really are trying to go gluten-free, there certainly can be some benefits, and it's really up to you how you feel specifically. So look at your individual symptoms, your biofeedback, your training performance. How does this impact your ability to manage your hunger, cravings, blood sugar, and other important considerations when it comes to picking the best nutritional strategy for you? If you want more info on all of the common gut irritants, so if you go back to my audio feed on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, I actually have an episode on 3 tiers of common gut irritants. It's episode 499 in the audio feed. So if you're on YouTube and you've never checked out the audio feed, there's literally hundreds of episodes with free content just for you. If you are on audio and you're kind of an OG listener, I appreciate you. Make sure you're subscribed so you never miss an episode, and head over to YouTube. Also make sure you're subscribed there and give us a thumbs up to support the algorithm. If you enjoyed today's free content and you appreciate the information that my team and I share here, please be sure to leave a 5-star rating and review on audio, or if you're on video, leave a comment or a thumbs up. Make sure you're subscribed, hit that notification bell so you never miss a video. If you enjoy discussion around digestive health, what to do in terms of navigating different challenges related to the gut, determining nutrition that's optimal for an individual, and really scaling that both from beginner, intermediate, and advanced approaches, then you definitely want to check out my nutrition and metabolism specialization program for coaches. You can learn more about this at metabolismschool.com. It's the only live program of its kind that's accredited by 5+ organizations inside our industry, and really speaks to some of these topics like, for example, nutrition and gluten, but also considering what we need to do on the lifestyle side, movement side and supplement side, versus more of a myopic approach that oftentimes many people will take when talking about this type of content on social media, and especially if you're watching on YouTube, sometimes can get a little crazy over on the YouTube. So I appreciate you guys for tuning into today's episode. Thanks for lending me your ear, and I'm excited to talk to you in the next show.